Okay, now we have our bottom tab bar navigator in our app. So we go from page to page, from search to upload to activity to profile. But say we want to add the same functionality to each page. So right now we have the add and subtract, the same type of functionality we did in our web application and now on our home page in our Expo app. But say we want to reference this state in other components. How do we do that? So like I said before, this state is specific to this component. Before we passed it through the different components through props, but we're not explicitly using other components, we're using React navigation. So now we want to get into Redux. And this is a little bit more complex, so hopefully you stay with me. But Redux is basically just if you have this state for this component, Redux is instead a state for the entire app. So the idea is that if we have count in Redux, we'll be able to reference count in search, we'll be able to reference in upload, activity, profile, any page within our entire app. And that's why we wanted to start using Redux. The adding subtracting this number is not super applicable because we don't really care about that moving forward. It's just an example to use. But say we want to log in a user, and once that user logs in, they have a unique ID, a name, a photo, and we want to reference that in other pages. We want to be able to reference that in the profile. We want to be able to reference that when they upload a post to automatically pull in that user information and add it to that post. We want to be able to find all the activity based on that user ID. So we don't want to be able to have to call it every single time on each different component. So that's where Redux and a global state comes in handy. So once a user logs in once, it'll store that information in the global store and then be able to reference in all the components, all the children components. So to get started, we're going to do yarn add Redux. And you'll notice that each of these things we add is not specific to React Native or Expo. It's actually a React feature. And if you want to even go even further, what we just installed of Redux is just pure JavaScript. It doesn't care about React, it doesn't care about React Native, it doesn't care about Expo. It just cares that it's plain old JavaScript, which is awesome because just like we could reuse some of the components, but some of the components' names are different, like view versus div or text versus a p tag. Redux, you can just copy and paste all of it. If you have all of your functionality in Redux, you could use all of that within your web app, within your iOS app, within your Android app, and it'll be exactly the same, which is awesome. So Redux is just pure JavaScript, whereas yarn add React Redux is specific to React, obviously. And so this will just allow us to import a provider component. And so where we're going to put all of this is in this app.js. So that's why I wanted to remove everything else out of this component, because this is going to be the core of our app. When Expo loads, it first looks for this app.js file and then loads everything below it. So everything within this file below this is its child. So app is the parent, and then tab navigator is the child. Under tab navigator is activity, profile, upload, and so on. So it has just like basically a tree. You have the parent and then everything below it. And so if we create a store within here, then every component below it is going to have access to that store. So we're going to do import store from, actually I need to look at some references here because I kind of forget. So we have the Redux basic example. We did npm install, or you did yarn add Redux. So we're going to do import create store from Redux, and then import provider from React Redux. And then we're also going to create a reducer. So we're going to create a new folder called reducers. And I'll get a little bit more into this in the next video. But this is basically the state itself. So in order to create a store, think of the store as the app-wide state. We need a reducer to store that state. And in this, we're just going to do index.js. So if we go to Redux, so like I said, you could actually reuse Redux in anything. It doesn't even have to be React. You could use it in Angular if you wanted to, or Vue probably. So we're just going to actually use this example because it's the same example that we use, but the Redux version. So we're going to create this counter, and it's going to initialize with this state of 0, and it's going to have a case of increment and a case of decrement. And it's going to do exactly the same thing that our home page is doing with adding and subtracting. Instead, since we put it in this reducer, this will be available app-wide instead of just the home component. So we have this set up, and I need to reference one more thing. So we have store. That's what I'm missing. So we're going to create a store from this importing of Redux, and we're going to pass in the reducer. So we have to import our reducer first, actually. So we're going to do reducer, and that is in our reducers folder. So reducers. And since I just called it index.js, you don't actually have to specify /index.js. So this is the same as this. So if you just have if you name anything index.js in a folder, it'll automatically look for the index file. Just like you would have index.html. If you have a whole set of HTML files, the first main page is always going to be index.html. And so we're going to pass in this reducer into create store. We don't have any middleware yet. We'll go over that later. But we're going to use this provider. And as you can see, this is why it's React Native specific. Uppercase and then store. It takes in a prop of store. And we created our prop already, or our store already, which is called store. Expected reducer to be a function. So we're going to do export default. So as you notice, this is ES5. It's just declaring a function called counter, and it takes in 2 arguments of state and action. Instead, we're going to use ES7 export, and we have to export the file or export the function equals. And then the arrow function. So let's see. Okay, now that works. So just like we're exporting, you're going to get used to this ES7. Just like we're exporting a component, export default, and then we're doing the class of app, extends React component. We have to export default a function called counter, which takes in 2 arguments of state and action. I'm watching the football game as well, so I won't edit that out. Let's go Eagles. By the time this goes, who knows if they're still in the playoffs. So we have this counter function, and we're passing it into create a store. So now, hypothetically, since we're passing in this reducer that we just created called counter into our store, which is the top level provider, and it's passing in store into tab navigator, technically you should have access to that state through each one of these pages. And in the next video, we're going to go in how to access that state, because it's not just going to be this.state or this.props. You have to do a little bit extra work to be able to connect to the reducer to be able to read that action and to be able to read that state. So hypothetically, we'll be able to access the store, which is passing in the reducer. So we'll be able to access this counter of state equals 0 and be able to call a function of increment or decrement and have access to that through all the pages, since it's the top parent element being passed down to the tab navigator, which is being passed down to all the screens, as you can see here. So it's not just as easy as just calling this .props.counter. We have to add a few more features in the components itself to be able to call the increment and decrement actions, and then be able to read the store of the counter if it's 1, 2, whatever it may be. So you'll be able to increment on one page and then read it on another page, or decrement on another page and read it on another page. So it'll be global. It doesn't matter. It's not component specific.